The four characters who make up Team Avatar for the majority of the show's runtime make for one of my favorite team dynamics from any cartoon. All of their personalities just clash and come together in a way that, even when an episode is fairly boring otherwise, it's still enjoyable to just hear these guys talk to each other. So with that in mind, an episode where the four of them only have a smaller than normal B-plot must be pretty rough, right? Well, perhaps that would be the case if the show couldn't rely on their Fire Nation equivalents to lead what ends up being one of my favorite episodes from the entire show, The Beach, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, we're going to go through 22 minutes of some of the angstiest stuff to ever be animated, and talk about how, through a litany of really well done scenes, the show both sets up Zuko's final redemption, as well as Azula's ultimate downfall.
Don't girls like stuff like this?
Maybe stupid girls.
Before getting into what the title of this video is referring to, I think it's worth starting this video by talking about the B-plot that's going on throughout all of the Fire Nation drama. While Zuko and company are busy having fun and being humanized and whatnot, Team Avatar is attacked by an assassin sent upon them by the Fire Prince, only to narrowly escape with their lives. And while it initially seems like this B-plot doesn't really need to be happening in this episode, I think it does serve three different purposes. For starters, and this is definitely the least important, but I think that having Aang and his team appear in every episode of the last season of the show does help the pacing of the story. The fact that Combustion Man appears in multiple episodes helps to emphasize this idea of him being a real and a persistent threat, which ultimately helps raise the stakes when he does finally get defeated. Reason number two for this plot being in this episode is that, given that the stuff at the titular beach is largely dialogue focused, outside of some pretty impressive volleyball choreography that we'll talk about in a bit, there really isn't a ton of action in this one, something that the B-plot definitely fixes. I especially really love the beginning of this fight and how they completely cut out the music. While Avatar obviously has a great soundtrack, I do think that the show in general could have benefited from more moments like this, where you can really hear the complete panic that breaks apart Team Avatar's restful trip. And finally, the biggest purpose that I feel that this part of the episode serves is how it completely juxtaposes what's going on in the A-plot. As I'll talk about a bunch in this video, it's pretty hard to watch this episode and not feel bad for Zuko, especially with his little monologue right at the very end, but it becomes a little bit easier when you realize that he is directly responsible for the hell that we're watching Team Avatar go through. While the Fire Nation teams all mope around about having to go on a beach vacation, Team Avatar can't even enjoy a little rest without an assassin trying to kill them and forcing them to flee. In a second, I am going to start talking about the actual part of this episode that you care about, but I do think it's worth looking at the rest of this one through the lens of what Zuko, and by extension the Fire Nation, has already done. Anyway, let's finally talk about the A-plot of this episode, and the stuff that truly makes this one great. After finally getting back into his father's good graces by supposedly killing the Avatar, Zuko has been rewarded by Ozai with a forced vacation with Azula, Ty Lee, and Mai. And while Ty Lee is obviously pretty happy with a break from being embroiled in Fire Nation politics, just like a bunch of other things in this episode, this sets her apart from the other three, as they feel like they're being treated like little kids, sent away while more important things are going on. And while this doesn't quite make sense from a logistic standpoint, especially considering that you would think that Azula would be a part of any plan, it does set up this really interesting premise that the rest of the episode follows. As we see four teenagers who were forced to grow up early try to actually act their age. The rest of this episode, at least until we get to the campfire scene, generally expands upon this idea, as while the kids explore and Ember Island, the place that supposedly helps you understand yourself and each other, we essentially get to see how each one of these not-so-normal teens interact with their peers on vacation, interspersed with some Zuko and Mei relationship drama and some history about Azula and her brother's time on the island. This comes in 3 sections, the first of which being a beach day that, after Zuko's kind gestures are shut down by his emotionless girlfriend, and after Azula watches every boy on the beach pamper Ty Lee, eventually devolves into the team playing volleyball, which is a terrific visual representation of the point that this episode is trying to make about these 4 characters, and especially Azula. Besides just the fact that it shows just how strong and athletic these guys are in comparison to the other rich teens as a result of their extensive training, it also shows how the idea of a game is somewhat foreign to Azula, who sees it as nothing more than an opportunity to prove dominance. When Ty Lee and Mei are invited to a party as a result of their general non-Azula-ness, she begins to rethink whether or not this approach is beneficial in a non-war setting. Speaking of which, the next section of this episode, after a brief food intermission, takes place at said party, and divides the group into pairs. To talk about the Mei and Zuko half first, after spending the entire trip trying to get any kind of reaction out of her, while also acting paranoid whenever she glances at anybody else, when Zuko returns from getting food to find her talking to a different guy, he obviously snaps. And while this episode will make it pretty clear that this isn't just because of Mei, it's pretty difficult to not sympathize with both characters in this moment. Zuko is obviously going through a ton of mental anguish, and yet is still trying to get his girlfriend to open up, only for her to do so with seemingly the first guy that she sees. At the same time, Mei is also going through some stuff, and is having to deal with a boyfriend who's lashing out at every little thing. This blow-up leads to a short breakup that definitely resembles a good chunk of stuff in a different Avatar show, but moving on, let's talk about the more interesting and definitely the funnier half of the party with Ty Lee and Azula. In a broad sense, this part of the episode showcases the pair having the opposite issue, as Ty Lee can't keep the boys at the party off of her, and Azula can't get any of them to stay anywhere near her. And while this does initially lead Azula to lash out, just like her brother, eventually Ty Lee gives her the advice to just act dumb and laugh a lot in order to try and reduce some of her intimidation, something that Azula obviously struggles with. And while this advice is inherently a bit ridiculous in a Nickelodeon type of way, I think that Azula's attempt to follow it does provide a bit more insight into her character. Even when she does pull this off for a bit to talk to Chan, it's clear that after everything that she's done that has created the Azula of today, there's really nothing that she can do to pretend to be somebody else. And while the first chunk of this episode that I've now written like 1,400 words about is definitely the funniest half, it's hard to not point to the final few minutes of this one being anything but clearly the best part. And while the campfire scene at the tail end is what gets the most attention, I think my favorite part of the episode is actually Zuko walking back to the place of so much childhood joy, and wondering how everything has gotten so messed up since then. It's just such a well done scene, with Zuko's moody walk across the beach to his family's old vacation home being interspersed by memories of growing up and spending time with them. Something that he could still have if not for his family's eagerness for war. This frame of Zuko with Iroh and Luten is definitely the most devastating of the bunch, as not only did the war take Iroh's only son from him, but because of Zuko's actions, it's taken him away from his uncle as well. Eventually, the scene climaxes with the Fire Prince finding an imprint that he made with his mother as a child. But now, the artwork that once exactly represented him feels foreign. Everything that happened on that island feels like less than a memory of Zuko, as he, along with the rest of his family, have taken so many steps away from the joy that they experienced during that time. And this is the mental state that Zuko is in when Azula drags him to the campfire, where each of the 4 teens gets a moment in the spotlight, whether they like it or not. And while this scene is definitely a bit over the top, as any sense of subtlety burns in the fire, it also just has a tremendous amount of characterization for all 4 characters that's impossible to dislike. To start with the non-royals, Ty Lee's moment comes when Zuko accuses her of not living in reality, finishing his insult by calling her a circus freak. At this point, Ty Lee becomes the only character in this emotional roller coaster to actually tear up, as she tells her quote-unquote friends about growing up with a bunch of sisters who looked just like her, and how she clinged to the circus for any sense of her own identity. It's a very sudden but well done amount of depth for a character who hasn't really had any. And then May talks about being told to be quiet or something. Seriously though, I think May's part in all of this is clearly the least well written, to the point of it pretty much being a joke when she says that she's not going to give a sob story, and then proceeds to go on and on about having to stay out of trouble and not being able to express herself. Something that Azula kindly recaps for anybody in the audience who's zoned out. It's the one part of this episode that I find myself liking less and less every time I watch, and it doesn't help that it's sandwiched in between 2 great moments. Speaking of which, while the Ty Lee and May parts of this scene are more or less about the audience learning about their past, Zuko and Azula sections are looking towards the future. To start with Zuko, after Ty Lee makes a comment about skincare, it perfectly launches Zuko into talking about his father, making sure that he never had to worry about that, or anything that a normal teenager usually would. But now, none of that matters, as he finally has what he wants, as his father has once again accepted him. At least, it wouldn't matter if he still wasn't so miserable. Zuko has spent 3 seasons chasing exactly what he has now, and yet it's only made things worse. Any moment of joy that comes from being in his father's good graces is now accompanied by 10 moments of intense guilt for what he did to his uncle and what he did to the world. Zuko has betrayed everybody who has ever cared for him, and he's been rewarded by feeling worse than ever before, ending his monologue by answering the question that everybody wants to know. Who is he actually mad at?
I'm angry at myself!
While Zuko's part of this episode is all but over with this line, we actually end the campfire scene with a focus on Azula. For anybody over the age of 10 who's been paying any attention to the show, from as early as the first season, Zuko's redemption is never something that's in doubt. But there definitely are some question marks around Azula. I mean, is the show really not going to redeem a 14-year-old girl who grew up in the same horrific environment as Zuko? And that's the dilemma that the final few lines of this episode, outside of the party-destroying scene, focuses on. As we see Azula attempt to give her version of a sob story, going a little bit into how she perceived that her mother viewed her, only for her defenses to kick in, as she turns it into a joke to avoid being vulnerable with her friends. Unlike her brother, whose cognitive dissonance has become almost comically external, Azula has already decided that what she is doing is wrong and that she's okay with it. She tells the group that she's a monster that is inherently incapable of doing anything that isn't monstrous. And while Azula simply refuses to let this moment change her, the rest of the characters certainly have, as Ty Lee hints towards the impact this will have on the rest of their stories.
The beach did help us learn about ourselves. I feel all smoothed. I'll always remember this.
As I mentioned about 15 seconds ago in video time, but about 3 days ago in writing time, the conversation on the beach ultimately foreshadows the direction that each of these characters will take. Ty Lee talks about how she's associated being in a uniform group to be this horrible thing, only for the finale to show that she's once again found peace in being with people like her in the Kyoshi Warriors, as they're a group that gives you the benefits of sisterhood while also allowing for independence. Zuko's arc is something that everybody has been giving their take on for over a decade, but I do think that it's worth mentioning that this episode is one of the first indicators of the exact direction that his story takes. Zuko was always going to end the series as a good guy, but the end of this one, and especially his big moment, is indicative of how he finally redeems himself by acknowledging that, while he has been put in a rough position, he is the only one who controls his destiny. And while that does make him responsible for all of the horrible things that he's done, it also makes him the only one capable of changing his story. Something that makes his redemption something that television animation is still trying to constantly copy. Obviously, the stars of this episode are Ty Lee and Zuko, but I think I've said a good chunk about both of them already. So instead, I'm going to finish this video by talking about Azula. While this is one of the last times that we see Azula before everything goes wrong for her, this episode still provides so much insight towards why her story will ultimately end the way that it does. Why Azula isn't redeemed. Even before her moment at the campfire, we get to see Azula react to the concept of doing things for mutual benefit, such as not dominating a volleyball game or not intimidating every boy that she talks to, and how, after giving it a quick try, she decides to permanently go back to her old ways of dominance, aggression, and ultimately arrogance. Unlike Zuko, by the time that we see Azula, there really isn't any part of her, at least that she's willing to let others see, that has any desire for things to be different. Azula has decided that she was born evil, will live evil, and will die evil, and that ultimately that's all she'll ever be. As Lo and Lee told the Fire Nation teens, Ember Island will tell you about yourself and about those around you, but unfortunately for Azula, it can't make you do anything about it. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who watched this video, despite it being about a show that I don't usually talk about. If you want a more effective way than the comments to tell me that this video is twice as long as it needed to be, you can find my Twitter hidden in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a little less than a week for a video that I promised quite a while ago. Thanks for watching.